Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Decatur 202 on housing affordability. We'll get started in just a minute. Got people filing in to from the waiting room into the Zoom room. So we'll get started in just a few minutes. Thank you for joining us. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us at the Decatur 202 on housing affordability. We're right at about 4:02. Folks are still joining in, but we've got a packed schedule, and we've also got some events around Decatur later on tonight. So seems like a good time to get started, and we'll get it started from Mayor Garrett.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Hello, everyone, and I'm Mayor Patti Garrett, and I do want to welcome you to the second of our 4 Decatur 202 strategic planning sessions. Since launching our Destination 2030 process last January, hundreds of Decatur neighbors have spent time together identifying topics we want to address together over the next decade. First in person, then in online forums and discussions like this one. As you might expect, housing issues is one of those important issues and topics. Input today will help us shape the policy and recommendations we'll unveil in the next year. And even then, we'll continue to welcome your input right up until the time a completed draft document comes before the City Commission. So thanks for joining us. The knowledge and passion of our Decatur residents is what makes our community planning efforts and our community in general so successful and so special. And as we start this session on housing, I want to say a special thank you to the members of the Affordable Housing Task Force that are a part of this evening and for attending, and also to Doug Faust, the Executive Director of the Decatur Housing Authority, who also participated as a member of that task force. So now I will turn it back to our moderator, Jeff Koski. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Garrett. Appreciate that very much. Again, everyone, we appreciate you joining us. I am Jeff Koski, president of Blakely Advisory Group and a member of the Strategic Plan Consulting Team. My firm is responsible for the real estate market analysis piece of the overall strategic plan. And we've been involved in analyzing development trends in Decatur for many years. And as Mayor Garrett said, I'll be the moderator for this session for the next 2 hours. You'll notice just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. You'll notice that your camera has been automatically disabled. We ask that you just keep that off until after hearing from our panelists. At that point, after you hear from the panelists, you'll have a chance to turn your camera back on and get into breakout groups and interact with your fellow Decatorites. So your time is coming. We'll be engaging you with a few interactive questions and polls throughout the session. You'll see details for how to participate in those polls in just a bit. If you have any questions, please direct those to either Renee Madison or Woody Giles in the chat window. Hopefully by now you're familiar with how Zoom works, and the chat window can be your guide, and that's where you can reach out for help either to Renee Madison or Woody Giles at any time in the next couple hours. If you have to leave us early and won't get to participate in the breakout groups, please check Decatur2030.com for instructions on how you can participate at home. And that is really your resource for any and all things for the Decatur strategic plan as we move forward. Again, Decatur2030.com for all your strategic housing or for strategic plan needs. So let's get started with just a few polling questions real quick. Just kind of want to get a sense of who's here, who's joining us. I think we've got some polling questions up. You can see the first one has come up now. In which part of Decatur do you live or do you own a business? Looks like we've got some pretty good representation. The Responses are rolling in. Not sure if you can see this on your screen, but the horse race is being led by the northeast quadrant of the city so far. Downtown's coming in fast around the corner, but split out about quarter of the folks are from the northeast part of town. Looks like we've got pretty much responses from everyone. Great representation from across the community. And Northeast takes it. So here we've got about 30% of the folks from Northeast part of the city, but again, great representation from across the city. We'll move on to the second question. How long have you lived or owned a business or worked in Decatur? Wow, we've got some longtime folks joining us. 30 years plus is taking the lead.
Wow.
Got some newcomers. About 20% of the people have been in Decatur for 9 years or less. So that's good. 30 years or more, it takes it. We've got some great experience in the room with us. And again, thanks to everybody for joining us. Appreciate it. I think we've got one more question. How have you been involved in the strategic plan process so far? And you can pick more than one. Hopefully you came on opening night when we were still able to be in person. That was a great night, and boy, things have really changed since then. We appreciate everyone sticking with us through the pandemic. I know it's been a challenge. We wouldn't have chosen to do it this way. We would love to have been in person with you for this 202 and for all the events. Obviously, we weren't. But again, looks like 2/3 of you were there on opening night. So at least we got to embrace each other at that point, and we're looking forward to it again. 10% of you, this is your first time participating in the strategic plan process. Thank you very much, and we hope you come back. There will be 2 more 202s along the way, which we'll talk about more as we go. But again, thanks to everyone who's stuck with us since opening night, and thanks to everyone who's joining us for the first time. 80% of the people have participated in a roundtable, so that's great. These 202s, for those of you who are here for the first time, these 202s are really intended to dig in deeper. We've gotten great, fantastic input in the roundtable sessions that have occurred already, and these 202s are really intended to really dig in deeper on topics that may have been controversial, if you will, or places that we need to find more consensus. And certainly, we'll hope to get some of that tonight. Let's see. I think that's the end of the polling. I am not mistaken. So we will move on. So hopefully you've had a chance. I believe there was a 20-minute video link, or a link to a 20-minute video sent out, Segregated by Design, or you've read the book called The Color of Law, both by Richard Rothstein. If you've had a chance to either see the video or read the book, that's a great primer for today's housing discussion. If you haven't watched the video, Segregated by Design, or read the book, Color of Law, I highly recommend it. Very enlightening books and video. And I promise that you'll learn something about American history and about the history of housing, about the history of zoning, about the history of segregation, and how they're all tied together. So again, I recommend those tonight. And again, if for those of you just joining us, I'm Jeff Koski. I'm the moderator of the panel tonight. We'll have a short video here, and just not the Color of Law video, but we'll have a short video introduction. We'll move into a panel discussion between myself and other experts, housing experts, and then we'll get into breakout sessions. So you'll have a chance to interact with your fellow Decatorites tonight. So with that, let's cue the video.
housing isn't just about shelter. It's also fundamental to issues like inclusion and equity, which is why it's a topic of considerable concern to Decatur residents. How do we know? Because before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, when our strategic planning process was getting underway, nearly 800 Decatur residents committed to a series of roundtable discussions exploring their likes, frustrations, and ambitions for our city. And you know what? Housing affordability and its impact on diversity was among the things they discussed the most. The issues they raised are now being tested and refined in our virtual forums. And so far, it's much less about if affordability is needed and much more about exactly what, where, and how affordable and workforce housing can be accomplished. Some progress has been made. Last February, the city received the Affordable Housing Task Force report and has since adopted the recommended inclusionary zoning ordinance and has hired a dedicated staff member. But the report includes much more for consideration, like how we preserve existing affordable units, or revise zoning regulations, or apply financial strategies and assistance programs, or consider the potential in surplus and underutilized land, or strategies that restore duplexes and triplexes as allowable neighborhood building types. How can we further educate the community on these critical issues, and what kind of partnerships can help us be successful? How do these different approaches affect progress on other big picture issues, like transportation or climate action? What does a successful approach to housing look like in a city of 25,000 people within a metropolitan region of nearly 6 million?
All right, so that brings us to the heart of today's Decatur 202 session, where we'll help unpack some of these questions that we're asking the video with the help of some experts from Decatur and throughout the Atlanta region. We'll take a deep dive into the issues regarding affordable housing, and we'll work together in small groups at the conclusion of our moderated panel. Again, for those of you that are just joining us, thank you. I'm Jeff Koski. I am part of the consulting team, president of Blakely Advisory Group. I've also been a longtime resident of the city of Decatur, reaching back almost 20 years. Housing and a household's ability to afford a home appropriate to its station in life is one of those issues that is impacted from numerous angles. So whether it's your job location, household income, available public schools, location to other services, location to friends and family, all of these things are considerations for folks, for you as you're making housing choices. And all of these collective choices drive local housing markets, whether it's in Decatur or any local housing market. It's a very complex set of decisions that drive the pricing of homes. And just a little aside, my family and I moved to Decatur, as I said, nearly 20 years ago. I took an entry-level professional job in a brand new industry, again, entry-level job, and we found a fantastic house right in the heart of Winona Park for $250,000. It needed a little work, but it was perfectly move-in ready, and we quickly became integrated into our wonderful new Decatur community. At that time, again, nearly 20 years ago, we didn't know how lucky we were. Again, with that level of salary, there's no way that my family could do that today. And it's a challenge that we know, we feel privileged that we were able to, quote, get in when we did. And I know many of you out there could tell a similar story or weren't able to get in at that time. And I'm fairly certain that no one feels great about this fact, that it's difficult to get into Decatur today. We know Decatur is a unique place. It's a very desirable place to live for many, many households because the city is in high demand. It's constrained in just a little over 4 square miles. We're experiencing what we all learned in our Economics 101 class: high demand, low supply. Where does that leave us? Increasing prices. And that's what's going on. High demand, low supply, increasing prices is what's driving our affordability crunch in the city. And the shift to higher home prices is either a cause in the dramatic changes in Decatur's socioeconomic makeup, or it's an effect of those higher prices. It's either a cause or an effect. Of course, it's kind of like the old nature versus nurture debate. It's a lot of both. So before we get to our panelists, to put a finer point on this, I just wanted to share with you some interesting data points that highlight this intersection between Decatur's housing market and its socioeconomic makeup. So again, if you kind of see the slides on the screen, you can see that Decatur's increase in those households earning over $100,000 has increased nearly 20%, from 28% of all households in Decatur making $100,000 or more in 2007 to 46% today, and it's continuing to increase. Next slide. And the implications of this are great. Again, we've become much more of an affluent community, of course, but not everyone has shared in that growth. Not all of us have had our incomes increase, and not all of us who have moved here have been able to afford that entry-level home. And you can see here that the overall, in the past almost decade, Decatur residents, the overall median income has increased 31%. So we're at just under $100,000 median income now. But unfortunately for Decatur Black residents, that increase has only been 12% in the same time frame. So again, it points to the fact that while the tide has been rising in incomes, it hasn't lifted all boats. And that's had even further implications. Next slide, please. You can see here the decline in the Black population of the city of Decatur, whereas in 1980, Black households made up over 40% of Decatur's distribution of households. Now we're down to under 20%. So we've become a significantly different kind of place, which has been driven by the increase in incomes, which has been driven again by the increasing housing market and the change in the housing market. Next slide, please. So these implications are far-reaching for our community. One thing I want to kind of just kind of put out there as this discussion occurs today, think about it's not just about housing, but the fact that we as a society insist on having parking spots for our cars. We have to house our cars as well as ourselves. And it's important to note that over 10% of a mortgage or a rent is going to go to housing your car typically. Now, again, not everybody has a garage to park their car in. Not everybody has a car, but those that do are paying to house your car in addition to housing yourselves. And so I think that's some piece of the pie that we need to consider as we get into our breakout groups later on today. Next slide, please. Now, the housing crunch that we have, we've got tools to address the housing crunch. Decatur Housing Authority is one of our very best tools. We're lucky to have one of the best housing, if not the best housing authority in the state here among us. And you can see some of the key facts that over 1,000 Decatur residents are housed in DHA units. The schools are 8% of the city school students come from DHA units. But the problem is this is one tool to house Decatorites. It's not nearly enough, right? You can see the waiting list for Decatur Housing Authority is 10 years long. And there's just not enough of those units to really tackle the affordability crisis that we have. So what we're going to explore later on today is what other tools can we employ to really tackle the issue, because Decatur Housing Authority will play an important role, but it won't be the only tool. And so again, as we encounter this crunch that we've been going through on the housing side, we've seen a lot of new housing units go up, particularly downtown. You see the cranes and you wonder who's going to live in all of those units. Well, the fact is that as our housing market has grown, the share of renter occupied units in the city has actually decreased. And that because supply is not keeping up with demand, that's actually causing a further crunch in the cost burden. So as we're not adding enough rental units to keep up with the number of ownership units, our cost burden on renters have gone up. And by cost burden, we typically mean spending more than 30% of your income on housing. And so we're at a point now where nearly 50% of our renters in the city of Decatur are cost burdened, or they're spending more money than they really quote unquote should be on housing. Next slide. And so this has, again, far-reaching impacts. And you saw this if you looked at the discussion guide that was emailed to you. These numbers, when we think about who among us that works among us can live here, it's becoming increasingly difficult for those who make the lowest incomes in our community to actually live here. Again, a teacher's aide, with a salary of $21,000 a year, particularly if that's a single person without another income to support that household, there's really no housing options in Decatur for this very important person among our community. Next slide is Michael, the custodian, making $35,000 a year. And again, Michael may have a partner that is sharing the household costs with, but if not, on that $35,000 salary, it's extremely difficult to find a rental unit and certainly a for sale unit that would be appropriate for Michael to spend only 30% of his income on housing. Adrian, the police officer, obviously very important to the community, and wouldn't it be great if our police officers lived among us? But with a salary of $43,000, Adrian has very, very limited housing options in Decatur. Adrian, at that point, again, as a single income household, could only afford about $1,000 a month in rent. And those are very limited options in Decatur. And even on the next profile, we have Emily, who's a teacher making over $50,000 a year. Emily's also going to have a very hard time, particularly buying a new home. Again, this was about, I mentioned my situation almost 20 years ago. This was about me, similar in terms of my salary and what our housing cost was. And it was not that difficult necessarily. Today, Emily's going to have a hard time. And even the last profile, Sarah, who's a professional making $82,000 a year, she can't afford to buy the average price home in Decatur, which is now nearly $700,000. So these profiles kind of put a face on the issue that we have, that if you're not making over $100,000 in Decatur and you don't have a dual income household, it's difficult to find a place to live. And that's really what we're facing. So with that, I'd like to bring in our panelists. Tonight we have two topic experts who will kind of take the ball and run with it from here. We have tonight Elka Davidson, who is an urban planning expert with her own consulting firm, Davidson Consulting. But most importantly, Elka was the chair of the 26-member Decatur Affordable Housing Task Force that Mayor Garrett mentioned earlier. And this task force produced a 73-page report highlighting affordable housing issues, goals, and strategies that, as the video said, the City Commission adopted as official policy in February. We're going to give Elka a chance to describe the task force findings, but first let me introduce to you our other panelists, James Alexander. James is the president of Mercy Housing Southeast. Mercy Housing celebrates stable, vibrant, and healthy communities by developing, financing, and operating affordable, program-enriched housing for families, seniors, and people with special needs. Mercy Housing Southeast is really a gem of an organization in the Atlanta region. Their projects are some of the most well-done affordable housing, and James is here with us to provide a practitioner's perspective on Decatur's quest to enhance housing units for all of us. So with that, let me throw it over to you, Elka, and give us an idea of what you and the task force were up to over the course of many months.
Thank you, Jeff. Welcome to everybody this afternoon. We've got 95 participants now online, which is fantastic that there's so many people in Decatur that are concerned enough about affordable housing that they're dedicating part of their afternoon to it. As Jeff said, my name is Elka Davidson. I'm an urban planner. I've been working in affordable housing for the last 20 years. And I was honored to serve as the chair of the Affordable Housing Task Force. So the task force, if we can change, thank you, came at the end of a series of studies and reports and plans that the city of Decatur had been involved in There were 7 separate studies, reports, and plans from 2008 to 2018, some of which were dedicated specifically to the issues of affordable housing, all of which had significant recommendations about affordable housing. The last one was the 2018 Housing Summit. Perhaps some of you participated in that. And out of that summit was the recommendation to convene a task force to come up, to study the issue and come up with a set of recommendations for the city. Next slide. So before we get to this slide, I just want to tell you the city did an open call. Over 80 people responded. They interviewed all of us, selected 26. We had long-term residents, community activists, faith leaders, foreign nonprofit developers, bankers, nonprofit funders of affordable housing. The Decatur Housing Authority was represented. And we worked together for 8 or 9 months in several committees and came up with a report that Jeff referenced. And I just want to emphasize something that Jeff said in his presentation. We submitted this report to the commission on February 24th, which was only a couple of weeks before COVID shut everything down. And I think all of us would have understood if the city were not able to take on some of the recommendations right away because of the incredible burden of COVID. But I just want to give credit where credit is due and say that we on the task force have been really impressed with how the city has moved. They have dedicated $100,000 that wasn't even requested to the Affordable Housing Task Force. They put aside funding for 2 years of a housing planner. They passed an inclusionary zoning ordinance, and they're getting ready to present for consideration an impact fee ordinance. So that was really above and beyond what the city could have been expected to do in the crisis that we're in, and I wanted to give them my kudos. So one of our committees was looking at how many affordable units did Decatur need to produce and preserve in order to address our needs. And this slide represents what came out of that gap analysis. Broken down by area median income, we're looking at a total of about 160 units a year per year over 10 years for a total of 1,600 units. And I want to point out that this number is both too low and aspirational. It's too low because what this committee defining affordability landed on was what would it take to address the needs of the folks who are currently housing burdened in Decatur? And these are the numbers that they came up with. This does not take into consideration, however, the number of folks that'll be moving to Decatur, the number of jobs that'll be developed in Decatur, which we might want to capture some of those workers and provide housing options to them. So 1,600 sounds like a lot, given what the city has been able to do to date. But I just want to let everyone know that it's not as much as is actually needed, but we wanted to find someplace in the middle that was aspirational but doable.
So Elka,
Also,
I'm
pardon?
sorry. Those are really eye-opening numbers.
They are.
Can you kind of get into a little bit about what the task force was able to kind of conclude about strategies and tactics that may be used to tackle some of these issues?
Well, if we go to the next slide, I'll start off by talking about the core principles and themes that came out of our conversation that both drove the recommendations that we came up with and derived from the analysis that we did. So the first one, you've already mentioned, Jeff, that affordable housing, well, it's a moral and practical issue on its own face, is linked and integrated with a range of issues that that lead to having a vital community. It's economic development, because here's another kind of startling piece of data. Only 4% of people who live in Decatur currently work in the city of Decatur. That means 96% of us are driving elsewhere or commuting in some way elsewhere to work. And that has huge implications for transportation, for congestion, for the transportation planning that's happening as part of this strategic plan, and for some of the sustainability goals that the city has. I want to emphasize too that we are at the end of our time for discussion. You know, as these 7 studies over 12 years, residents of Decatur have said consistently that they're pro affordable housing, but for a variety of reasons, we haven't really had the political will to get stuff done. And if we don't act now, given rising land and property taxes, it's not going to happen. It's going to cost too much to achieve even a fraction of the goals that we've set out. The third principle that I want to emphasize to people is that because of the small size of Decatur and the relative affluence of Decatur, we are not something called a participating jurisdiction, or a PJ, which is a designation that HUD uses to determine how they're going to distribute federal funds for housing. So we don't get access to much of the as-right federal funding, which means we have to use local revenue, which means we're going to have to really look hard at what we're willing to pay for and get creative about how we're willing to raise those funds. And I think maybe one of the most important principles that we came up with is that we as a community are going to have to learn how to embrace density, because without kind of strategically applied increased density, given the size and how relatively built out Decatur is and how much land costs, we won't be able to afford to produce these units. And when I say come to grips with or embrace, I mean in terms of land use planning and changes to our zoning code, in terms of project design, in terms of mitigation strategies for the potential transportation impacts, and in terms of the kind of community conversation we want to have about density and how we can do that courteously and creatively and collaboratively. Next slide, please. I think one of the things that I wanted to point to that I didn't speak about when we had the goals slide is that there are, surprisingly, and I think on the task force we were surprised by this, 933 units of what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAH housing, which means housing that did not get any public subsidy at all, but is affordable to residents at 80% of area median income or below. Because there's no subsidy attached to it, there's no requirement for it to stay affordable. And I think all of us have seen a lot of multifamily projects and duplexes that have been turned into townhomes starting in the low 500s. And so we really wanted to make sure that we made some recommendations about how we could keep this NOAH housing affordable over the long term. One of the most important things I think that we're going to have to look at is how to acquire land for affordable housing development. Land prices in Decatur are significantly higher than in the region. And the city itself doesn't own very much developable land. Over the last couple of decades, they've been selling off their city-owned land without putting much or any requirements in terms of how it was to be developed. And right now, our new housing fellow, Kristen Allen, has done some initial analysis, and there's 5 or less developable parcels that the city currently owns. So we're going to need to figure out how to raise funds to acquire property so that we can write down the cost of that property and make developing affordable housing more affordable. Linked to the density issue is, oh, hang on. Go back one slide, please. Sarah. Thank you. I think we skipped one. I think the last 3, I want to say that a lot of affordable housing that's developed with public subsidy is only required to stay affordable for a certain period of time. That can be as short as 5 years for a down payment assistance program, for example, and as long as 35 years for a multifamily property that's funded through the low-income housing tax credits. When that requirement is finished, the unit can be rented or the house can be sold to whomever that person wants for however much it wants. And the community loses that affordable unit and you have to find new subsidy to replace it. So we wanted to look at recommendations for how we could have permanently affordable units. Finally, multifamily outperforms single family every time. The average cost, as Jeff indicated for detached single-family homes in Decatur is $667,000. And for attached single-family homes, like a townhome or a condo, it's $345,000. And the amount of subsidy that would be needed to get somebody who's of a moderate means into that house makes it almost undoable. So a lot of our focus is on multifamily. And then again, the naturally occurring affordable housing, what can we do to preserve it? So do you want me to go into the recommendations per se?
I think if you can kind of hit the highlights, Elka, we got to make sure we get done.
Yeah, how much time do I have left, Jeff?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So there were over 20 recommendations, and we knew that there wasn't going to be time to go through all of them. So we picked the top 7, I believe, that we thought would have the highest impact, and that we wanted to get more insight from community members about their thinking about it and where it ranked on priorities of how to move forward on this. So the tax relief for NOAA housing, we are proposing a 50% property tax abatement for folks who are providing naturally occurring affordable housing. And we ran the numbers, and it's about $960 a unit, or a little bit less than $1 million a year, which is significantly less than what it would take to replace these units should they succumb to market pressure and not be affordable anymore. We had a lot to say about where we might look at developing a strategic land pipeline, from working with local churches who might have extra land they want to sell us, negotiating with DeKalb County, looking at underutilized parking lots downtown. We also
the legacy park properties that the city owns. Would that fall under the land acquisition?
Well, that's already been acquired. And I just want to point out just one to the side for Legacy Park. I believe, and Jeff, you can tell me if I'm right, that the current master plan recommends between 150 and 175 units, the majority of which should be affordable. That's exactly what we need per year for the next 10 years. So think about the scope of that, the scale of that, the density of that, and what it would take to reproduce that every year for the next 9 years.
In our 4.5 square miles.
In our 4.5 square miles, that's right.
It gets hard.
So as a result, one of our recommendations is to allow duplex and triplex and quadplex development, so 2 to 4 unit apartment buildings in parts of the city that are zoned single family. Right now, 91% of all the residential land in the city is zoned single family, which means we're going to have to make some changes to that strategically and gently, and perhaps over time. But we're going to have to be able to increase density in single family neighborhoods. And I want to point out, I live in a single family neighborhood, and there are already duplexes and triplexes in my neighborhood, because until the mid 80s, the zoning ordinance in Decatur allowed for that kind of development. In their wisdom in the mid 80s, they changed that, and our proposal is that we change back. Another strategy for increasing density is accessory dwelling units, which are the kind of small kind of grandmother's cottage in the back of your house that you build, or you build over your garage. It has many benefits. It can be a source of income for homeowners. It's a gentle way to increase density in a neighborhood. It's actually currently allowed under the UDO, the Uniform Development Ordinance, or the Unified Development Ordinance. It's not, however, allowed in single family neighborhoods. So that's something that needs to change. And we are proposing creating a pool of funds to help people finance the development of these ADUs. Next slide, please. Back to the permanent affordability principle that I referred to. Community land trusts are a mechanism for ensuring that properties remain affordable in perpetuity. I don't think we have time to go into the structure of a land trust, but the Decatur Land Trust was formed a couple of years ago. It's still, as I understand it, board only. It's not funded. That needs to change. Innovative housing typology is another gentle way to increase density and decrease cost for new housing. We're recommending that the city look at supporting, whether that's from a land use perspective or a financing perspective or a marketing perspective, in addition to ADUs and allowing for duplexes to quads in single family neighborhoods, things like tiny homes, things like cottage courts, things like modular housing, which is currently not allowed under the zoning code, as a way of using smaller pieces of land and reducing the cost of production. And then the last two recommendations that we're asking you to chew on. Go ahead.
Sorry, if I could interrupt, I'm gonna have to kind of leave those opportunity bonds and the TAD discussion.
Okay.
And absolutely, hopefully we can get back to it at the end of the discussion, but.
Okay, just two options for funding all this important work that needs to be done.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the key, right? Is that, and James will absolutely hit upon this, is that, you know, this issue that we have with affordable housing is large. The pool of money to deal with it is not large enough. And so I think that's a pretty good segue maybe to kick it over to you, James. And again, thank you very much for jumping in on this panel. I know you are very familiar with Decatur and our housing market here, but work really throughout the Southeast and getting affordable housing done of all types, again, throughout the region. And so, again, thank you for joining us. And what can you tell us about, you know, the difficulties of getting affordable housing done and how we might go about it in Decatur?
Yeah, thanks. I'd love to talk about that, and you know, hope to keep my piece of the presentation short so you all can get to the discussion. But we'll say that we do work around the Southeast and around the country, and I've seen a number of affordable housing studies put together by jurisdictions, and the work that the task force has done and that Elka just talked about is some of the best work I've seen, period. So, you know, some of my thoughts are just to do what's in the task force recommendation. I think the report is excellent. And also, Jeff, since we're doing, you know, Decatur credentials, we have to throw those out. I was born in South DeKalb, off of Columbia, so Decatur was a bit of a center city for me, even though I lived outside of it. So know and love Decatur well. So I'm with Mercy Housing Southeast, and I'm the president of the organization. We're a nonprofit who builds affordable housing and also provides supportive services for the families and seniors who live in that housing. We mainly work in the Atlanta metro area and in Savannah, but nationwide there's Mercy Housing Development in California, in the Northwest, and also in Chicago. Next slide, please. So I'll skip through this pretty quickly. And since this is a 202, I just wanted to really highlight that there are many different kinds of affordable housing. And you know, what you see driving down the street may be one particular kind, but I think it's important to understand that affordable housing really is a continuum or a spectrum in many ways, moving all the way from being unsheltered all the way to what we would call market rate housing. And I'll highlight just a few of these here. Will you skip to the public housing or Section 8 slide? Next one. Great. So you mentioned the Decatur Housing Authority. Absolutely right. It's you know, one of the best, if not the best, in the state. So it's amazing to have that resource locally. Public housing or Section 8 housing really targets people below 50% of area median income, those daycare providers, after school teachers. Much of that is housing authority sponsored. And across the country, there's about 3 million public housing units, and that's not really growing. And the federal government, you know, really isn't increasing the amount of funding for public housing and Section 8 housing over time. So that's a really critical element of housing in the Decatur community, as Jeff mentioned. But as in Decatur and other places, you'll see when Section 8 voucher waiting lists open up, sometimes you see lines around the block. This is really housing where residents pay 30% of their income towards rent, regardless of how much they make. Next slide, please. So there's also housing at 60% of area median income. That's, for teachers 1 through 4, that's a, City of Decatur designation, sanitation equipment operators, a lot of people working in retail. There is a program available which really helps to serve this population, and that's called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's the largest producer of affordable housing in the US. And there's been 3 million units built under this program since 1987. And there's been over 3,000 units built under this program in the region in recent years. So it's within the spectrum, one of the few kinds of housing where there is significant subsidy available to deliver. And so it's really important, whether you're talking about naturally occurring affordability or new development, to really position yourselves to be able to capture this kind of investment. Next slide. So with workforce rental housing, that's at 80% of area median income. And when we talk about area median income, it's often a designation that is used to define what the maximum income of a family should be living in that affordable or workforce housing. And what is the area? It's really looking at the region overall. So it's a bit of affordable housing jargon, but it's a way to think of who are the people and who are the families who we're seeking to serve with this housing. You're really talking about fire inspectors, sous chefs, people working in the restaurant industry. And these are units that are produced by inclusionary zoning units. They can be produced in ADU rentals or accessory dwelling units. And also in that naturally occurring affordability, and you heard Elka and Jeff mention that there's over 900 units in Decatur that are currently unsubsidized and serving residents at 80% of AMI. Will you skip to market rate? All right. So I think one last thing to just mention is that I think a lot of folks see, housing that are at the left side of the spectrum as this is the subsidized housing. And, the people who are living in this housing are really living there on the public dime. The truth is all of us are in some form, shape, or fashion. And, the house that Jeff bought 20 years ago, when he pays his federal taxes, he gets a mortgage interest deduction. Those deductions and the value of them in terms of the subsidy are greater than all of the subsidy, federal subsidy that's provided to the left piece of this spectrum or continuum. So it's just really important to understand that, we're all subsidized in some form or fashion. And it's really about, what we prioritize and how we distribute that subsidy. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show just a few images. And the point of these images is a couple of things. It's that affordable housing comes in all shapes and sizes. I will say that the one that you see here is one that you're going to see less in Decatur from an affordable housing perspective for the reasons we talked about. Land is expensive. It's going to be really difficult to produce a single family affordable housing home. So you've really got to be looking at options that include duplexes, triplexes, and much more to reduce those land costs. Next slide. This is an example in the Edgewood neighborhood built by Columbia Residential. This really looks more like townhomes, but they really are rental, and they're meant to really integrate into the surrounding neighborhood. And this is to say that affordable housing comes in all shapes and sizes, and also to say that it should be of a quality, and often is of a quality, that you would put your mother in, your father in, you'd recommend that your friend would live in. It is of quality. So it's not a product in neighborhoods that is really other. It should really integrate into the community. Next slide. We've seen this many times, Oakview Walk. I think this is a great example. Next slide. This is the Mercy Housing Development for seniors in the Chamblee neighborhood that is more in an industrial setting. But this is about 70 units on an acre and a little less than an acre and a half. And it's parked at 0.5 parking spaces per unit. So as Jeff mentioned, one of the main costs of building affordable housing and building housing in general is how do you house those hunks of metal. Next slide. And I'll just provide as an example, we're working in a neighborhood in the city of Atlanta with a nonprofit, and we've been working with them for about 6 months. And the main challenges are zoning, working with the city to acquire a designation that will allow us to build the affordable housing. And that requires a significant number of conversations with neighborhoods and city officials. And there's a lot of opposition. There's opposition around density. There's opposition around the kinds of people who would live in the development, frankly, although people won't necessarily say that directly to your face. And there's challenges around financing, which I will get to. So next slide.
It's your 5-minute warning, James.
All right, great. So why is this so difficult? And I'd say that for all affordable housing, the main difficulties around zoning, which I just talked about, around sufficient amounts of land to get it done. And I think that's a special issue in the city of Decatur because there's not a lot of land, and money, both in terms of not having enough subsidy, and also because usually with these kinds of developments, when you're doing it at scale, you're really piecing together a lot of different financing sources. So this is an example of one housing unit. So why don't we just implement the recommendations of the report? Can we just get to the number of affordable housing units per year? No problem. This is one of the main challenges. So, building an affordable housing unit at $170,000, it's possible that that unit, will require finish upgrades, may require some level of structured parking, which increases the cost of that unit in an environment where land is at $2 million an acre. You can get up to $230,000 per affordable housing unit, even when you're building density. And so in terms of the financial sources to get to that $230,000, the basic challenge is the people you're serving and the people we're serving at 60% of area median income are not making that much money and can really only afford about $850 in rent. Therefore, we could get a bank loan of about $75,000. That leaves a gap of $155,000 for a single affordable housing unit. And so when we talk about the financial challenges, this is an example. There are some ways to address it. Next slide. So I talked about the low-income housing tax credit. This is a ready way to bring in additional resources. The 4% tax credit is less competitive than other resources that are out there, but there still is a queue for it. By bringing that in, that can reduce the gap to around $80,000 per unit. Next slide. And perhaps the land is city-owned land and the land is granted, that could bring in an extra $40,000. Next slide. So that's to say that one of the most ready ways to create affordable housing at scale, there's still a gap that requires local subsidy to build that affordable housing. There is a program called the 9% low-income housing tax credit. When that is available, essentially there is no gap, but those resources are few and far between, and you really cannot rely on them. The city should do what it can to really prepare sites for that, but you really cannot depend on it. Next slide. So some key kind of rental financing takeaways. One, density is really important. Two, really to target the 9% low-income housing tax credit. It's scarce, but there are ways to prepare for it. I think, as Elka and Jeff said, really use what you got. So if there is city-owned land, or if there is naturally occurring affordability, really work to target that first. I think at the end of the day, in order to do this at scale, it's going to require subsidy at scale. And so, I think one of the basic takeaways, and to get to Elka's point, we work with many jurisdictions, and it's really about moving from Houston, we've got a problem, and there's a lot of municipalities and jurisdictions that are there, to putting together a plan in place, and there are many jurisdictions that are there, to the political will and being able to put the funding at scale in place in order to really meet the need. And so I hope that the city and that the people of Decatur are really moving in that direction. So I will stop there. Thanks for the opportunity to chat with y'all.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you so much, Elka. Man, that's a lot. I know if you're one of the 94 participants out there, you may be feeling like you're drinking out of a fire hose, but Elka and James just couldn't have laid it out any better in terms of, the issues that we have here in Decatur, the ways that the task force has proposed that we might tackle them, or at least some of them. And James really did a great job highlighting what affordable housing can be, should be, but how difficult it is. And for me, the one thing that I'll take away that James said that I've known, but this is a fantastic reminder, and I appreciate you mentioning this, James, as a guy with more privilege than I deserve, that $250,000 home was subsidized, right? It wasn't subsidized by a Section 8 voucher. It wasn't subsidized by the Decatur Housing Authority, federal funds from HUD, but it was subsidized by the mortgage and the mortgage tax deduction that I was able to get. And I think that's important for all of us to remember, and not to get too preachy, but that we're all in this together. We're all being subsidized. We're all at different points in life. And so I think that's just really a great reminder. If you can only remember one thing out of this, I think that's something great to take away. So we're at about the right time for us to get into our breakout groups. I know you've heard a lot. You've been drinking from a fire hose. We appreciate you sticking with us. Hopefully you've learned a thing or two and can kind of bring that to the discussion. So we're going to go to the breakout groups. Those of you who've been in the 202s before, or in the previous 202, you know how this works. But you're going to be randomly assigned into a breakout group. You'll receive a prompt when you enter into the room via the Zoom platform. You'll also receive periodic reminders to switch questions. You've got 4 questions to go over once you get in there. When you are in there, if you have any specific questions, you can raise your hand. Someone will either enter the room to respond, or there will be a consultant or an engagement squad member who will be in there with you. So if you have questions, we can get them answered. But before you get going on the questions, again, the questions were emailed earlier. The questions are also over in the chat if you didn't get a chance to look at them beforehand. But before you get going with your group, once you get in there, please select a note taker. Somebody's got to step up and take notes, please. And that person will really lead the discussion and report back at the end. And as you guessed it, will also be responsible for taking notes. So you'll answer the 4 questions at the end of the breakout groups. We'll reconvene and hear from each note taker, who will be responsible for then submitting your responses later. And note takers, you should have this email address, Decatur destination affordability@gmail.com. We would love you to send your notes back in. But again, you should have the questions by email. They're over in the chat to go through. And again, there'll be somebody to get you there. So I have on my clock that it's 5 o'clock right now. So we've got 50 minutes to get through 4 breakout questions. So you'll have until 5:50 to answer all 4 questions. So note taker, again, that'll be your job really to keep us on time, about 10 minutes per question or so, with a little wiggle room in between. So let's see. We are about ready. Note takers, I just want to remind you again to, if you can, put your answers in the group chat. And I think we are ready to do this.
Over.
Gannon is joining us from the Mediterranean. Looks like the weather's nice there. So we're all we're making our way back into the main room. I know the group that I was with, really interesting discussions, as expected. But again, thank you all for staying around. We've got about 15 more minutes of time, and we're going to do a little call out or report out. That's the word I'm looking for. Reporting out to find out a little bit more about what other groups were talking about. Quick reminder for the note takers: if you need to get your notes in order, you don't have to get them too much in order. Don't worry about it too much. But Decatur destination@gmail.com. If you could email your notes in the best shape that we can get them in. If you have a picture of the a 2x2 matrix that you could include, again, if it works to get that included in there too, that'd be great. But Decatur destination@gmail.com for the note takers. Looks like we've got most everybody has come back. I know a few people had to drop off, so looks like we're up to 70 participants. So I think it might be a good time to have our little readout. We're not going to go through all of the questions, but the first question I want to kind of put on the table is, which affordable housing strategy did your group place in the upper rightmost corner? If you didn't get into exactly placing all the pieces in all the right places, just kind of give us an idea of what you thought would be the most effective in your neighborhood in addressing the overall affordable housing issues. Kind of what did your group decide were the most effective, the most bang for your buck, if you will? Does anyone want to unmute themselves and take a shot at it? Give us an idea what came out of your group. Oh, sorry. I had I had the logistics wrong. We're using the chat. We're not talking yet at this point. We're going to open it up. I apologize for this. We're going to open it up if we have time at the end. But right now we're doing this on the chat. So thank you. I see them coming in. Apologize for the confusion on my part. So the note takers, if you can kind of put as much as you can into the chat so we can get the readout over there, that would be great. So I see Paul saying 1, 2, and 3 were in the northeast quadrant. I think the group that I was in were somewhat similar. It looks like Kate was in my group, so that was right. that 1, 2, and 3, it seems like were really the most bang for your buck, if you will. And just as a reminder, that 1, 2, and 3, if I can pull those up again, the naturally occurring, the NOAA naturally occurring, which I think it makes a lot of sense. In the neighborhoods, they're already there. We just got to keep them affordable by any means necessary. Duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. Some of you, we haven't mentioned the word, and I can't believe we've gotten this far and no one has said missing middle housing. But that's, if you may have heard that term, many of you have heard that term probably ad nauseum if you're in the housing space enough. But that number 2 really is the missing middle that, again, was mentioned, that Elka mentioned. We had that's the historical housing that we had, and we got rid of it in the 80s. And I think if you think about the Color of Law book that I mentioned earlier, and you think about the zoning changes that most communities made in the 80s around the country, you might find some linkages there. So, I'm kind of jumping ahead, but, I think if we think about what anti-racist policies we might have, think about our zoning as the historic reasons for our zoning, there might be some answers there. I see Paula saying that your group got hung up on costs. Absolutely, NOAA was the one thing that was doable, but I think any of us that have discussions about affordable housing would agree with you, Paula, that the money's the thing. As James pointed out, building housing ain't cheap, and it's getting more expensive. And so where do you come up with the money? It's one thing to promote affordable housing. It's another thing to build affordable housing to get the money there. I see from Paul 5 and 6 also there, land acquisition and the Decatur Land Trust as being effective. And so I think that's great that we're kind of exploring all those options. Let's move on to the next question that we're going to put in here. And again, I kind of led into this question already, but who had some good ideas on anti-racist housing policy in Decatur? I know this is something that has been obviously a hot topic of discussion, anti-racism throughout the spring and the summer into the fall in our country. And I think it's important that we think about anti-racism and our housing policy going hand in hand. And so we're really interested to determine what thoughts the community may have in this regard. As you note takers are putting answers into the chat box here for your anti-racist housing policies. Again, we're seeing that kind of back to the first question, that was a lot of those recommendations in the first question, 1 through 6, are popped up in all those groups. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see which we can move forward in Decatur as strategies. I think Casey Boyce makes a good point here, in that it's not just about the economic status, and again, to the Color of Law book, to the segregated by design video that I keep harping on. The history is not pretty in terms of our nationwide housing policy that filtered down to our communities. And so I would encourage us as a community, how do we fight back against that? What do we need to do to overturn those historic policies that have left us where we are today? Any other thoughts on anti-racism? And again, I think anti-racism as a policy is something that we can sort of find some common ground on. But where do we find the common ground between anti-racism and our housing policy? And I think that's a big question, absolutely. But I think some of these solutions in terms of getting the money into the right places, getting the money into the right hands can start to overcome some of the historically racist policies that undergirded our housing policy. But the question is, where does that money come from? Of course. Kate asked a good question, and I don't have an answer to it. Are there other cities that have policies in regards to anti-racist housing policies? What does that look like? And I know I heard that in our group too. You know, I think it's a topic that we haven't really explored much in this country up until really, 2020. And I don't know that there are a lot of great answers yet, and I think we should be continuing to seek them. Kathy's calling for wealth building through our housing. And again, I mean, I think that's really the number one way that families historically have been, those that have built wealth in this country have often built it through their real estate, through their house. And I think that's something that we have to acknowledge, right? It's not the stock market. It's not, the vast majority of people aren't investing their money in stocks or in businesses. We invest by and large in our homes, and we build our wealth. When we're lucky enough, we're able to build our wealth in the land that we buy. And so how can we expand that? And I think Kathy's got a great point that if we can expand the wealth in our homes, create wealth, allow people to enjoy the appreciation of their real estate that we know will happen in Decatur. So what are the policies that will allow that? I think that's something that we're searching for.
Jeff,
Reparations?
can I make a comment on that?
Please, Elka, yes.
This is a place where I think that the land trust model would be really useful. So I think it's going to be very difficult for people of moderate income to purchase property in Decatur from the free market. But if you buy a CLT home, the land is owned by the nonprofit CLT. So your price point is only the structure. And what we've seen nationally is that a lot of lower income folks are able to get onto the kind of rung of home ownership in the housing ladder through using the CLT model, and that between 75 and 80% of them move on from that CLT purchase to the traditional housing market, but they use the CLT purchase as a way to help build their equity so that they can get into a traditional home. And I think that would be fantastic for Decatur, and maybe the only way in Decatur that home ownership could be possible down the AMI ladder.
It's a great point, Elka. Thank you for chiming in. I appreciate that. We are just a couple minutes after 6. We promised to get you out of here at 6. The holiday tree lighting is at 6:30. I hope you can join that virtually. The sun has gone down, so it's officially Hanukkah. So happy Hanukkah to those of you who celebrate that. And the holiday tree lighting can bring home the Hanukkah celebration. So happy Hanukkah for all of you out there. But again, appreciate this. We've really been fascinating, the discussions that we've had along the way tonight. This kind of brings us to the end of the formal discussion. If anyone wants to stick around for the next 10 minutes or so, and we can open up the mics at that point, we can have a discussion if anyone wants to stick around. But again, I just want to say thank you. Be sure to visit Decatur2030.com for a recording of tonight's session and register for the future sessions. And just to plug quickly, we'll have a session on Thursday, January 14th. Equity and racial justice will be the topic of that, Decatur 202. And on Thursday, February 11th, we'll have a Decatur 202 on climate change. So please come back and join us for those final 2 Decatur 202s as part of the Decatur strategic plan. And again, thank you. And we will officially adjourn the Decatur 202 housing affordability session. Thank you again. I've still got my mic open. The panelists are going to stick around for questions. So anybody who wants to stick around, feel free, but we are officially adjourned.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting.
Thank you, Kathy.
Very informative.
Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Likewise, really, really appreciate this. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks for leading the conversation to get us all talking, and hopefully next to get us really putting some action behind some of these ideas that we came up with. So thank you for leading the charge.
Thank you for being here, Melissa. Appreciate it.
Jeff, this is Paul here. I wanted to thank you for highlighting the Richard Rothstein book. We've partnered with him quite a bit at Habitat across the country, and he really is kind of the leader in kind of documenting a lot of that stuff. So it was really exciting to see that, actually. So thank you.
You're welcome, Paul, and thank you for your work with Habitat.
I wanted to ask one question of Elke. One thing that you said in your presentation really hit me was that you said we needed to build or produce 175 affordable housing units a year.
It's about 160 a year.
Okay, and to reach what goal?
The Defining Affordability Committee decided to link their unit goals to what it would take to have nobody in Decatur living as housing burdened. So those 49% of renters and 26% maybe of owners who are currently spending more than 30% of their income, we kind of calibrated over 10 years how many units it would take to pull those people back into being not housing burdened. And as I mentioned, that doesn't take into consideration the projected number of people who might be moving to Decatur, who might be mixed income, or the people that are going to be taking the new jobs in Decatur that are projected to be in the kind of construction and service sector, most of whom make below 80% of AMI. And then we might want to capture some of them to be able to live in Decatur, so we don't have so many people driving in. But we had to pin it somewhere, and that was the easiest to calculate.
Okay, so you're just saying just addressing the needs of the people that are struggling
Yes.
to stay in Decatur.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a quick question to follow up on that. So if we're looking and talking about that subset of people as far as helping them to not be burdened and stay in Decatur, I guess I'm a little unclear. I assume they're already, well, not assume, they're already living in Decatur.
Right.
How do the affordable housing options that we discussed and that are being put out there address that need, or do they not directly?
Well, I don't know that we are assuming that if we build the 1,600 units that everybody who's currently housing burdened will move into them. They may elect to stay where they are and pay more than we as a nation think is appropriate for housing. So I think that the production of new units might absorb some of those folks, but likely it's going to absorb new folks. But we just needed a place to put our line in the sand to get to a number. And the projections of, well, two things. The number of people who are projected to move here and the number of jobs that are projected to be developed are just those projections. And it's a larger and kind of more complicated community conversation to say, well, what is the income range that we want to see? What does income diversity look like for Decatur? If we have 10,000 new people moving in over the next 10 years, what percentage of them do we want to be between, X and Y AMI versus, A and B AMI? And how do we build housing for that number? That was not part of our task as a task force. That's a really complicated political conversation to have. So we just wanted to be able to pin to a number that we knew was fixed, but we're not assuming that all of those people will see those new units and then move into them. We just wanted to find a number that was aspirational, that we could use to measure success. And honestly, I mean, the city has not really, except for the Decatur Housing Authority, which has done a tremendous job, the city itself, in terms of what it could do from a land use and a funding and a land disposition perspective, we've never produced a single unit of housing. So to say that we want the city to do 160 per year over the next 10 years is aspirational, but nothing good is easy. So that's where we kind of put our line in the sand.
Okay, and I understand what you're saying, and I understand the thought process. But if I take a step back and I look at that number and I consider that number based on the criteria that you just put out, it seems to me, and perhaps I'm missing something here, but it seems to me that in the end, whatever the end goal is not, we're not meeting the actual goal of helping the people who are housing, or potentially a very, let's say 25% of the 100, of the, whatever the percentage is of housing burdened folks in Decatur, that the affordable housing options and ideas that we're putting out there, and that we're using these numbers to help alleviate some of that burden, is not actually going to potentially really meet that end goal of the people who are living here now who are feeling that burden, rather than just moving out of Decatur, I guess.
Right.
Or moving into the house, some of the affordable housing.
Right. No, there is no, I mean, there are some strategies in the task force report that are focused on helping, lower or moderate income people who are living here to be able to stay here. So, for example, there's a proposal to expand the MLK program from a 1 day or 1 weekend a year to an all year program to fund that and staff that. And so to the extent that maintenance costs are part of the burden that an older homeowner who's been living in Decatur for a while and is at, between 60 and 80% of AMI, to the extent that maintenance costs are part of her burden, that means that she can't afford to stay there, then that would help that resident or that category of resident. But you're right, most of the recommendations are about how to change policy and raise funds in order to develop new housing, and how to preserve existing units so they don't go away. And then a smaller subset of stuff to help folks who are currently living here, where the intervention is focused on the resident and not on the unit, if that makes sense.
Right. Thank you very much.
So we are at 6:13 by my clock, and I've been instructed to shut this down at 6:15. So just a couple minutes, but I do want to acknowledge Sonali's question about which Decatur policies right now are racist. I mean, I think it's a logical question given what we've been discussing. And I think everybody might have a different answer to that. My response would be, I don't know that there are necessarily, explicitly racist policies on the book. I mean, that there are federal laws to keep that from happening. I think part of the idea is that we have a history of racist policies in our housing policy, particularly redlining, and again, a lot of the policies that were explained in the segregated by design video. And I think the idea is that we've spent hundreds of years under racist policies in this country. The idea is, how do we go about turning the tide on those? And so, I don't think anyone is necessarily indicting anyone for putting in a racist policy now. But I think the idea is that we have to acknowledge our history and work to overcome it. I think that's kind of my best answer. I don't know if anyone wants to take one more crack at it before we break for the evening.
Yeah, I had a question for Elke. So we've been looking at the cost burden for people who are living in apartments and things. Have we looked at all at the cost burden for people who are in these single family homes?
Yeah, the cost burden data that we looked at were both for homeowners and for renters. And so for renters, it's 49% of existing renters in Decatur are cost burdened. But for homeowners, it's 24%.
How did you get that information?
It's
How did-
from the American Communities Survey, which is a mid-decade kind of update to the census.
Mhm.
And so it's as of 2017. It's on page 18, Lynn, of the report.
Okay.
So you can check it out, and we've referenced the sources for the data.
So is that Decatur specific, or is that sort of a national or
So that's
Georgia?
Decatur specific.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And I just want to say too, we don't know, this is an overall number, like we don't know which individual houses or residents are cost burdened. We just know that the total number as a cohort.
Yeah, because I know, in the 30 years that I've been here, my taxes went up, double, triple.
Sure.
And I can tell you that we definitely lived more than 30% of income going to housing.
Yeah.
With two people working. So
24%.
yeah, so I'm kind of like, okay, well, how does that, and I'm not alone. So that's why I'm just kind of wondering, where those numbers come from. When we look at how, this, and affordable housing is a huge problem. It is a huge problem. And I really like the work you guys did on the, with the task force. I just wonder, how do we tackle it in a way that doesn't actually, as we help with the affordable housing part, how do we not also increase the burden on, our single family homeowners who are already stretched, right?
Right.
So, how do you make that balance? We don't have a checking account called bond, we just have to keep paying these expenses. And as we bring people into the city and we have more kids in the school systems, we have to build out more schools. How does that work?
Right.
So it's like, how do we, it's a very complex, it's a very interesting, but very complex topic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. And
All
I
right,
think I would just say just about the revenue front, I think that the report anticipates, and I would emphasize that there's no way that Decatur alone is going to be able to raise all the money, that we're looking at Decatur raising a certain amount of money locally. And I don't think we suggested raising property taxes. That was not part of the part of what we looked at or what we wanted to recommend in order to be able to leverage additional dollars externally. And whether that's the CRA investments from banks, Community Reinvestment Act dollars from banks, private equity, philanthropic dollars, trying to access some public sector dollars that James mentioned, like the low-income housing tax credit. I don't think anybody is anticipating that the city alone is going to be able to raise enough money, but we have to put something in the pot in order to leverage these additional sources of funds.
Yeah, well, like when we're looking at purchasing land, okay, so I'm looking at just, if you look at Legacy Park and you look at the Boys and Girls Club, I mean, you're already at $45 million, $46 million, right? Well, that's property taxes. So that's part of, when we start looking at land acquisitions, and I think I have a lot of different ideas about it, but anyway.
I'll jump in and say, I think there was part of the discussion that I forced Elka to skim over in her slides were some ideas about bonding, about using tax allocation districts, et cetera. So I think there are solutions out there. None of them are easy, but I think you're asking great questions, Cynthia, and I appreciate that.
Yeah. I just think that the city of Decatur, the residents will, I've heard from a number of them, they just want a voice when we have these kind of decisions or these kind of spending, that they have some say in what that number looks like and what it's being spent on and how it affects their lives.
Absolutely.
I think we all realize we're all in this together, and there's been a lot of things that have happened in the city in the last 10 years that have affected our ability to maintain a diverse population here.
Great point. It absolutely is. So we are going to have to wrap it up. These are big questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't stay longer to unpack them even further. We don't want to bump up against the tree lighting that is about to start. So again, thank you all for sticking around. And we hope that there will be a continuing conversation about housing as part of the strategic plan process, but certainly as we move out of the strategic plan process and into our everyday lives, that a lot of these discussions will continue, and they will have an impact on the affordable housing crunch that we have and the strategies that are made to overcome it. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye and good evening. And again, thank you very much. And we'll see you at the next Decatur 202. Appreciate it.